Firefighters force open a bedroom door. It's been locked from the outside. Inside, a man is lying dead on the bed. Burn marks cover parts of his body, and the damage is concentrated near the bed frame and around his head. But the rest of the room is almost completely untouched. Papers are still on the desk, the curtains are intact. It's the eve of Hari Raya Idul Fitri, the holiday marking the end of Ramadan. Across Malaysia, families are getting ready to celebrate. But in this home, Nazrin Hassan's family won't be celebrating. They will be planning a funeral. This is the case of Nazrin Hassan, one of the most talked about cases in Malaysia's recent history. And I have to say, this one raises more questions than it answers. It's the early hours of June 14th, 2018. In an affluent neighborhood in Petaling Jaya, Malaysia, a security guard notices something wrong. Smoke is rising from a two-story house. He walks closer and finds the homeowner's wife, Samira Muzaffar, standing on the porch. She isn't on the phone. She isn't calling for help. She isn't doing anything. For some reason, none of the members of the household called the emergency services. It was the neighbors who reached out for help. The firefighters arrived to find Samira still standing at the front door. She is completely expressionless. No crying, no wailing, even as her husband is burning in the room above her. There is no emotion at all. The firefighters rush upstairs. Inside the bedroom, they find Nazrin Hassan's body on the bed, with burn marks covering roughly 30% of his body. The room is partially burned, but the pattern doesn't look like that of an accidental fire. The damage is concentrated in specific areas, rather than spreading evenly across the room. Flammable items elsewhere are completely untouched. And another questionable detail is that Nazrin's body is just lying on the bed. There was no sign that he tried to escape, no sign that he tried to move at all. It was a very strange scene. What on earth had happened in this room? To understand why this case would go on to grip an entire nation, let's first look into who Nazrin Hassan was. He was the group CEO of Cradle Fund, a government-linked agency under Malaysia's Ministry of Finance. Cradle provided grant funding to early-stage technology startups, and over the years, it backed hundreds of companies, including a ride-hailing startup that would eventually become Grab. Within Malaysia's tech community, Nazrin was seen as something rare, a leading figure who genuinely understood entrepreneurship because he had actually lived it. Before running Cradle, he had been a startup founder himself. People who worked with him described him as articulate, thoughtful, and direct. He believed that entrepreneurs weren't just building businesses, they were trying to create something that mattered. He once said that Cradle's job was simply to help as many founders as possible reach commercial success, and that what they did with it after that was up to them. When people showed up for his funeral on June 15th, 2018, the turnout said everything. It was the kind of crowd you would expect for a head of state, not someone working behind the scenes at a grant agency. For many people in Malaysia's startup world, Cradle had been the only institution that ever believed their idea, and Nazrin had been the person behind that. For those who had questions about his death, his family and Cradle Fund had answers. Both groups stated that Nazrin had gone to sleep after taking medication for a migraine, and that while he slept, the BlackBerry phone charging behind his bed had exploded. The autopsy carried out at Kuala Lumpur Hospital appeared to support this. It concluded that his death was caused by complications from a blast and blunt penetrating injuries, consistent with a phone explosion. A tragic accident, case closed, except 10 days after Nazrin had been laid to rest, everything changed. On June 25th, a forensic report from the Fire and Rescue Department came back, and its findings didn't match the official story at all. The department found traces of petrol on Nazrin's body, on the bed frame, on the mattress, and on his phone. In light of these findings, the state's Fire and Rescue Department director said it was far too early to conclude that the phone had caused the fire. Then, on August 6, 2018, the police made it official. The case was reclassified. Nazrin Hassan's death was no longer considered an accident. It was murder. Rather than waiting for the authorities to act, Nazrin's siblings began pushing for answers themselves. His older brother, Dr. Malek Hassan, was the first to publicly question the autopsy results. Another brother, Dr. Abdulaziz Hassan, was a lawyer and helped coordinate the family's efforts. And their sister, Che Eleni Che Hassan, obtained the death certificate and compared it to the Fire and Rescue Department's findings. And things weren't adding up. She made a formal request to the court for the right to exhume Nazrin's body for a second autopsy. On October 1st, 2018, the Magistrates Court granted police permission to do exactly that. But Nazrin's widow, Samira, was opposed to this, and her lawyers challenged the decision. But the High Court upheld the initial ruling. Nazrin's body was exhumed on October 8th and transported to the University of Malaya Medical Center for a second autopsy. And here they uncovered something that the first one had not. Nazrin had not died from an exploding phone. He had died from multiple blunt impacts to the head. On March 12, 2019, 4 people were formally charged with Nazrin's murder. The first was his widow, Samira Muzaffar. The second and third were her 2 teenage sons from a previous marriage, then aged 17 and 14. And the fourth was Eka Wahyu Lestari, an Indonesian domestic helper employed by the family. For some reason that has never been made clear, Eka was charged, but never actually arrested, so she was absent for all court proceedings. They were accused of killing Nazrin at his home, sometime between 11:30 p.m. on June 13th and 4 a.m. on June 14th. The charge was murder, but it was brought jointly against all of them. This meant the prosecution had to prove not only that they had murdered Nazrin, but that they had acted together with the shared intention to kill him. In Malaysia, murder carries a mandatory death sentence upon conviction, though that doesn't apply to anyone who was a minor at the time of the offense. The teenagers were safe, but Samira's life was on the line. The trial began on September 6, 2019, before the High Court in Shah Alam. All 3 who appeared in court pleaded not guilty. The courtroom was packed. Nazrin had been a prominent figure, and Samira was by no means unknown. She was a senior executive at the Malaysian Intellectual Property Corporation, and her father was Chandra Muzaffar, one of Malaysia's most prominent political scientists and human rights figures. Her father sat in the public gallery to support her. These were not people on the margins of society. They were educated, well-connected, and high-profile. Exactly the type of people to draw public attention. And the case itself was compelling. The prosecution wasn't just suggesting the fire had been set deliberately. They were saying Nazrin may have already been dead before the fire even started. Blood spatter found on the wall of the burned room matched Nazrin's DNA. A National Police forensic officer testified that the pattern was consistent with blunt force trauma, not a blast, and that it must have occurred before the fire, because the evidence of this was found beneath the soot. The prosecution argued that Nazrin had been struck in the head with something consistent with a hammer, and that the fire had been set deliberately, in targeted areas to destroy the evidence. But there was another forensic detail that raised even more questions. A prosecution forensic witness testified that Nazrin had a penetrating wound track in his brain, measuring 6.8 centimeters deep and 0.4 centimeters in diameter. So to put that in perspective, that's a wound track into the brain that's about the length of a dollar bill, through a channel half the width of a pencil. A separate penetrating wound was also found on the front of his neck. How had he suffered so many different injuries? Before the trial, investigators had looked into whether these wounds could have been caused by something other than a blunt weapon. In September 2018, sources told local media that one of Samira's teenage sons had been brought in for questioning in connection with a neck injury. It suggested that the wound may have been caused by an arrow, and both boys were members of their school archery club. These details were never formally established in court. No findings were ever made linking any specific injury to a particular weapon or person. These remain allegations. But there were other things found at the scene that raised their own questions. When a forensic officer visited the house in September 2018, 3 months after the incident, he found 3 fragments in the compound consistent with arrow components. And inside the house, in a storeroom, he found a CCTV recorder. It hadn't been switched off. It had been completely disconnected from its wiring and removed from sight. So whatever happened in that house between 11:30 p.m. and 4 a.m. went undocumented. A firefighter also testified that on the morning of June 14th, the day Nazrin's body was discovered, he saw one of the teenagers leaving the house with a box. What was inside has never been discovered. But what could their motive have been? As the trial progressed, the prosecution called a series of witnesses to build a picture of the household. As a family unit, Samira and Nazrin had one son together, and both had children from previous marriages. From the outside, it looked like a stable, successful household. Nazrin's personal assistant called this into question, testifying that Nazrin's work performance had declined after the marriage. A colleague described moments where Nazrin seemed unsettled after phone calls with his wife, and said he had spoken about her spending, and at times had mentioned considering a divorce. The marriage may not have been as happy as it once seemed. There were also reports that Nazrin had received threatening phone calls, which he later discovered had come from one of Samira's children. The court also heard that Nazrin's clothing had been deliberately damaged by that same child. The defense pushed back on the prosecution's portrayal of a fractured family. Nazrin's driver testified that family outings in the months before his death seemed completely normal, nothing out of the ordinary. In addition, text messages from Samira's phone in the days before the incident were later described by one of the judges as normal, intimate exchanges between a husband and wife. The prosecution's main problem was that their case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Samira and the 2 teenagers were the last people seen with Nazrin before his death, and Samira had entered Nazrin's room about 3 hours before the fire broke out. She was later seen standing on the porch as smoke rose from the house, making no attempt to call for help and showing no emotion. And they said the fire had been set deliberately, in specific areas to destroy evidence. The defense dismantled each piece individually. They pointed out that the chemistry department had found no traces of petrol on the walls, directly contradicting the fire and rescue department's findings. They also raised serious concerns about how the scene had been handled. Because the death was initially ruled an accident, the house had never been treated as a crime scene. It had been cleaned. People had continued living in it. The arrow fragments and the disconnected TV recorder weren't found until 3 months after Nazrin's death. The blood spatter wasn't discovered until 5 months after the incident. The defense argued that, given all of this, the reliability of the evidence collected from the site simply couldn't be guaranteed. And then there was Eka Wahyu Lestari, the family's domestic helper. She had been in the house on the night Nazrin died. She had been charged, and yet she had never been arrested. She wasn't hard to find. She was living in another city, working in a coffee shop, and yet she was never brought before the court to answer a single question about what she might have seen. On June 21st, 2022, the High Court acquitted all 3 defendants without requiring them to present a defense. By that point, the 2 teenagers were 20 and 17. The judges found that the prosecution had failed to present even the minimum evidence required to proceed with the trial. There was simply nothing to show that any of the accused had caused Nasrin's death. Outside the courtroom, Nasrin's brother, Dr. Abdulaziz Hassan, told reporters the family still had unanswered questions and hoped the prosecution would appeal. His sister, Chayaleni Che Hassan, was direct. The family wasn't trying to send anyone to the gallows. They just wanted the truth. The prosecution did appeal. They raised the additional question of the door to Nasrin's room being locked from the outside. However, they still didn't have enough. On February 8th, 2024, the Court of Appeal dismissed the appeal. There was no proof of a common intention among the 3 accused. The petrol evidence was rejected outright, given its direct contradiction by the chemistry department. And the court noted, again, that another person charged with Nasrin's murder had been living openly within the country, and that nobody had ever gone to get her. The prosecution appealed one final time to the federal court, the highest court in Malaysia. On January 7th, 2026, the 3 judges unanimously dismissed the appeal. They, too, found the evidence to be insufficient. And so,